The vampire king discovered a blind pianist playing in his castle's sealed music room at midnight. What he didn't know, the melody she played was the exact sequence that unlocked his late queen's enchanted diary, hidden inside the piano for 2 centuries. Her fingers just triggered a curse he thought he'd buried forever. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Adrian Blackthorne had not stepped into the East Wing in 200 years. Not since the night he sealed every door with his own blood and swore he would let the dust bury what remained of his failures. But tonight the sound of piano music drifted through the stone corridors like a ghost made audible, each note a knife sliding between his ribs, and he moved through the darkened halls with the speed only his kind possessed, rage and disbelief warring in his chest. Because no one should be in that wing, no one should know those rooms even existed, and yet someone was playing in the music room where Alara used to sit for hours, her fingers dancing across keys while her belly grew round with the child they both believed would be their future. The servants' entrance near the old kitchens hung open, the lock broken, rain slanting through the gap and pooling on flagstones that had not seen water in decades, and Adrian's hands clenched into fists as he climbed the spiral stairs toward the source of the music, each step heavy with a dread he had spent centuries trying to drown in duty and distance and the cold comfort of an empty throne. The music room door stood ajar, pale light spilling from within, and when Adrian pushed it open, the scene before him struck like a fist to the sternum. A woman sat at the Steinway, her fingers moving across the keys with eerie precision, her rain-soaked coat dripping onto the bench, her face tilted slightly upward in the way of someone navigating the world without sight. And the melody she played was the one Alara had composed in the final weeks of her life, a sequence of 47 notes that spiraled through minor keys like a descending staircase, beautiful and unbearably sad. Adrian's breath caught, unnecessary though breathing was for him, because he had watched Alara lock her diary inside that piano with a blood spell keyed to this exact melody, a spell designed to open only when the sequence was played perfectly. And he had assumed the secret died with her, that no living soul would ever stumble upon the combination. Yet here was this stranger playing it note for note, as though the music had been written into her bones. He stepped forward, his voice a low rasp of fury and confusion, demanding to know who she was and how she had found this place. And the woman startled, her hands lifting from the keys, her sightless eyes turning toward him with an expression of alarm and defiance, her lips parting to speak. But before she could answer, the piano gave a sharp crack like splitting wood, the soundboard buckling as though struck from within, and a leather-bound book tumbled out onto her lap, its cover dark with age and marked with silver runes that pulsed faintly in the dim light. Adrian recognized it instantly, his heart lurching with a terror he had not felt since the night Alara died, and he lunged forward, reaching for the diary, but the woman's fingers had already brushed the cover, and the spell activated with a sound like shattering glass, black veins erupting across the backs of her hands, spreading up her wrists with the speed of spilled ink, and she cried out, her body jerking as though struck by lightning, the diary falling from her grasp as she tried to push it away. Adrian caught her as she collapsed, her weight slight in his arms, her skin burning hot against his cold hands, and he looked down to see the veins crawling up her forearms, dark and pulsing, a curse he had seen once before on the night Alara died, the night she pressed her bleeding palm to the piano's strings and whispered words he could not hear, sealing her rage and grief into wood and wire and waiting. The diary lay open on the floor, its pages igniting with silver flame that gave off no heat but filled the room with light. And Adrian watched as words burned into visibility on the topmost page, the handwriting unmistakably Alara's, elegant and furious. The one who plays my song will carry my death, unless the king gives what he stole. The woman in his arms was gasping, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts, and she turned her face toward him, her eyes wide and unseeing, but somehow finding him anyway, her voice shaking as she said she had only wanted to play. The door was open. She had not meant to take anything, and Adrian felt something crack in his chest at the innocence of it, the terrible randomness, because this woman had no idea what she had walked into. No idea that her desire for shelter and music had just signed her death warrant. He told her she had taken everything, his voice raw with a grief he had not allowed himself to feel in 2 centuries. Told her that Melody died with Alara, and now it was killing her too. And the woman stared at him with a mixture of terror and fury, her hands trembling as she looked down at the black veins spreading across her skin, visible even to her in the way they pulled and burned. Adrian's mind raced, cataloging the details with the cold efficiency of someone who had ruled for 300 years. The curse was a widow's knot, designed to transfer the original victim's death onto anyone who triggered the spell, a punishment Alara had crafted in her final hours, when she knew he would seal this room and never speak the truth, and the only way to break it was for Adrian to return what he had stolen, though the diary did not specify what that was or how he was meant to give it back. The woman was struggling now, trying to sit up, her voice gaining strength as she demanded to know what was happening, who he was, what he had done to her. And Adrian felt a flicker of something he had not experienced in a very long time. The presence of someone who refused to be cowed by him, who looked at him with anger rather than deference, and he realized with a start that he did not even know her name. He asked, his voice quieter now, and she told him through gritted teeth that she was Iris Tremaine, a pianist from the village of Kinloch, that she had been walking the moors when the storm hit and saw the castle lights, found the open door, heard the piano calling to her the way beautiful instruments always did, and she had simply wanted to play, nothing more, nothing less. Adrian looked down at her, this stranger who had stumbled into his past and pulled the pin on a grenade he had spent 2 centuries trying to bury, and he felt the weight of her mortality in his arms, the heat of her skin, the rabbit-quick pulse at her throat, and he knew with absolute certainty that if he did not find a way to break this curse, she would die the same death Alara died, slowly and in agony, her body consuming itself from the inside out. The diary's flames were fading now, the words sinking back into the page, and Adrian made a decision born of desperation and a debt he could never repay. He lifted Iris into his arms, ignoring her protests, and carried her out of the music room, down the spiral stairs, through corridors that had not seen living footsteps in decades, toward the only person who might be able to help, his court physician Halloran, who had been alive long enough to have seen curses like this before. The storm raged outside, rain hammering the castle walls, and Adrian moved through the darkness with Iris cradled against his chest, her head lolling against his shoulder, the black veins now visible all the way to her elbows, and he felt the terrible irony of it settle over him like a shroud. He had sealed the east wing to escape his grief, to lock away the memory of his failures, and now those failures had found a new victim, an innocent woman who had wanted nothing more than to play a song in the rain. As he carried her through the great hall toward his private study, Adrian glanced down at Iris's face, pale and drawn with pain, and saw in her the echo of everyone he had ever failed to save, and he made a silent vow that he would not fail again, even if it meant tearing open every wound he had spent 2 centuries trying to close, even if it meant speaking aloud the truth he had hidden from his court, his people, and himself. Adrian's study was a fortress of dark wood and older secrets, shelves climbing to vaulted ceilings packed with books bound in leather and languages most living humans had forgotten, and he laid Iris on the leather sofa near the fireplace where embers glowed low and red, then moved to the bell pull and summoned Halloran with 3 sharp tugs that would wake the physician no matter where in the castle he slept. Iris was conscious but fading, her breath shallow, the black veins now creeping past her elbows toward her shoulders, and Adrian found himself watching the progression with a clinical detachment that did not quite mask the rising panic beneath. Because he had seen this before, had watched these same veins consume Alara in the hours after she birthed their son, had held her hand as the curse she had activated with her own blood pulled her down into darkness. Halloran arrived within minutes, a tall vampire with silver hair tied back, and the bearing of someone who had stitched wounds and set bones for 4 centuries, his medical bag already in hand. And he took one look at Iris and swore softly in a language predating English, kneeling beside her to examine the veins with gentle fingers that knew exactly what they were seeing. Adrian stood back, arms crossed, his face a mask of control, and waited while Halloran ran through his examination, checking pulse and temperature and the rate at which the curse was spreading. And when the physician finally looked up, his expression was grim in a way that made Adrian's chest tighten, despite the fact that his heart had not beat in 300 years. Halloran confirmed what Adrian already feared. Widow's Knot curse, blood-keyed and intent-sealed, designed to transfer the original victim's death onto whoever triggered the spell, and the progression suggested Iris had 72 hours at most before the curse reached her heart and stopped it the same way it had stopped Alara's. Adrian asked if there was a counterspell, a medical intervention, anything that could slow or halt the process, and Halloran shook his head, his voice quiet but firm, as he explained that Widow's Knot curses were among the oldest and most vicious forms of blood magic, crafted specifically to be unbreakable by anyone except the person who caused the original debt. The only cure was for Adrian to return what he had stolen, whatever that meant, and to speak the theft aloud before witnesses, preferably the court, because public confession was what gave the magic its release, the acknowledgement of wrongdoing in the eyes of those who mattered. Adrian's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides, and he told Halloran to find another way, his voice sharp with an authority that had ruled the Northern Territories for longer than most vampires had been alive. But Halloran met his gaze without flinching and said there was no other way. Not for this. Not when the curse had been crafted with such precision and rage. Adrian turned away, staring into the fire, and refused to explain what he had stolen, refused to acknowledge the question in Halloran's eyes, and the physician sighed and said he would consult his texts, see if there was any precedent for breaking a widow's knot without full confession, but his tone suggested he already knew the answer. While the two vampires argued in low voices near the fireplace, Iris pushed herself upright on the sofa, her body protesting the movement, her hands shaking as she braced against the cushions and tried to orient herself in a room she could not see. Her fingers found the armrest, the texture of old leather worn smooth by centuries of use, and she stood slowly testing her balance, the curse making her limbs feel heavy and disconnected. And she began to navigate the study by touch, the way she had navigated the world since losing her sight 7 years ago, in an accident she did not let herself think about. Her hands trailed along the wall, finding the spines of books, the edges of picture frames, the cool surface of a side table, and then her fingers brushed something small and metal, a music box perched on a shelf at shoulder height, and she lifted it carefully, turning it over in her hands to feel the delicate engravings on the lid. She found the winding key on the side and turned it, the mechanism catching and releasing, and the melody that emerged was achingly familiar. The same 47 notes she had played in the music room, the sequence that had unlocked the diary and triggered the curse, and Iris froze as the sound filled the quiet study, each note a tiny hammer striking her heart. She turned the box over, her fingers finding an engraved plate on the bottom, and she traced the letters slowly, reading by touch the way she had learned to read everything. For our son, who will never hear it, and then a single letter, E. The realization hit her like cold water, understanding flooding through the confusion and fear. Alara had a child, Adrian had a child, and this melody was meant for a son who never grew old enough to hear his mother play. Adrian's voice cut through her thoughts, sharp and too close, demanding to know what she was doing, and Iris turned toward him, the music box still playing in her hands, and she asked him directly why Alara had written a lullaby for a son who never heard it. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the tinkling music. And then Adrian crossed the room in 2 strides and ripped the music box from her hands, his control fracturing, and he hurled it against the wall where it shattered into pieces, gears and springs scattering across the floor, the melody dying mid-note. Iris flinched, but did not retreat, her anger rising to meet his, and she demanded the truth, her voice shaking but firm as she told him she was dying because of his secrets, and she deserved to know what she was paying for. Adrian stood with his back to her, shoulders rigid, and for a long moment Iris thought he would not answer. But then he began to speak, his voice low and raw, the words dragged out of him like shrapnel from a wound. He told her Alara died in childbirth, that the labor went wrong, that she bled too much, and the healers could not stop it. And in the final moments before she died, she delivered a son, a tiny fragile thing, who drew 3 breaths and cried once, before his heart began to fail. Adrian had held him, this impossibly small creature, with Alara's dark hair and his own pale skin, and he had made a choice born of desperation and arrogance. He bit his own wrist and pressed it to the infant's mouth, forcing his blood past the baby's lips, believing that vampire blood could heal anything, that he could turn his son and save him, that he could cheat death the way he himself had cheated it 3 centuries before. But the boy was too human, too new, his body too small to survive the transformation, and the vampire blood that should have healed him instead burned through his veins like acid, and the baby screamed, a sound Adrian would hear for the rest of his immortal life. And then the boy went silent and still, dying for the 2nd time in his father's arms. Adrian's voice broke on the last words, his hands bracing against the mantel, and he said that what he stole was those 3 minutes, the time between the first death and the second, the choice to let his son go peacefully versus forcing him to suffer because Adrian could not accept loss. Iris stood very still, her anger dissolving into something softer and more painful, and she said quietly that he had not stolen time. He had tried to give his son more of it, but Adrian shook his head and said Alara never saw it that way, that she watched him torture their dying child, and she never forgave him, that she wrote the curse in her own blood the night she died and sealed it into the piano because she knew Adrian would lock the room and never speak of what happened, never admit his failure to the court or to himself. The room fell silent, except for the crackle of the fire, and Iris felt the weight of his grief pressing down on the air between them, centuries of it compressed into this single moment. And she understood suddenly that the curse was not about punishment. It was about exposure, about forcing Adrian to speak aloud the truth he had buried. She opened her mouth to respond but stopped, her head tilting slightly, because she heard something the others did not. A whisper, faint and feminine, coming from somewhere behind her, and she turned toward the sound, her sightless eyes fixing on the large mirror mounted on the wall above a writing desk. The whisper grew clearer, words forming in a voice that was soft and sad and edged with steel, and Iris realized with a shock that ran cold down her spine that she was hearing a ghost, that Alara's spirit was bound to the diary and speaking now, reaching across death to deliver a message. The ghost said that Adrian thought he stole time, but that was not the theft. He stole her forgiveness, took it from her by hiding the truth, by rewriting their son's death into something sanitized and safe. And the ghost told Iris to make him remember what he owed, to make him speak the words he had locked away. Iris's breath caught, her hands trembling, and she asked aloud if anyone else heard that, her voice uncertain, and Adrian turned sharply, his eyes narrowing as he demanded to know what she meant. Iris described the voice, the words, and Adrian's face went pale, paler than death, because he understood immediately. The curse had given Alara a way to communicate, but only with Iris, only with the woman who could not see and therefore perceived the world through sound and sensation in ways the sighted could not. Halloran stepped forward, his expression fascinated and troubled, and he confirmed that ghosts bound to objects could sometimes manifest to those with heightened sensitivity, that Iris's blindness might make her more attuned to the frequencies on which spirits spoke. And Adrian looked at Iris with something like awe and horror, realizing that she was not just a victim of the curse, but a conduit for Alara's will. Iris felt the weight of that realization settle over her, the understanding that she was caught between the living and the dead, between a king's shame and a queen's rage, and she knew with sudden clarity that her survival depended not on breaking the curse through magic or medicine, but on convincing Adrian to do what Alara demanded, to speak the truth he had spent 2 centuries hiding, to give back the forgiveness he had stolen by refusing to let his failure be known. She looked toward Adrian, or where she sensed him standing, and said that Alara did not want her dead. She wanted him honest. And Adrian's response was a bitter laugh, hollow and sharp, because he knew that honesty would cost him everything: his reputation, his authority, possibly his throne, because the southern clans had been waiting for an excuse to challenge his rule and a public confession of breaking the turning law. Of trying to turn an infant without consent would hand them exactly what they needed. The fire popped and hissed, shadows dancing across the walls, and Iris felt the black veins pulsing in her arms, a constant reminder that time was running out, 72 hours to unmake 2 centuries of silence. And she wondered if Adrian would choose her life over his pride, or if she would die the way Alara died, a casualty of his inability to let go. Iris had slept poorly in a guest room that smelled of disuse and old stone, her dreams haunted by whispers and the phantom sensation of black veins crawling beneath her skin. And when Adrian came for her just after dawn, she was already awake, dressed in borrowed clothes that hung loose on her frame, her hands trembling as she traced the veins that now reached past her elbows, spreading like dark roots toward her shoulders. He told her they were going to try something, his voice carefully neutral, and he led her down through the castle's depths, through corridors that grew colder and narrower, until they reached a spiral staircase carved directly into bedrock, the steps worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. And Iris counted each one as they descended, 43 in total, her hand trailing along the wall for balance, while Adrian's presence moved just ahead of her, silent and tense. The air changed at the bottom, grew heavier, thick with the scent of earth and something metallic that made her think of old blood, and Adrian's hand found her elbow, guiding her forward across uneven stone. And he told her they were in the chapel's crypt, beneath the castle's oldest foundation, where the Northern Territory's kings and queens had been laid to rest for 1,000 years. Iris felt the space open around her, the acoustics shifting to suggest high vaulted ceilings, and she heard the soft hiss of candles burning, though Adrian told her they were enchanted flames that never consumed their wicks, never went out, eternal vigil for the eternal dead. He led her to the center of the crypt and stopped, and Iris felt him step away, heard the rustle of fabric as he knelt, and she asked quietly what they were doing here. Adrian's voice came low and strained, explaining that he thought perhaps a private confession might satisfy the curse, that speaking the truth to Alara directly, in the place where her body rested, might be enough to break the spell without the public spectacle that would destroy everything he had built. And Iris heard the desperate hope beneath his words, the bargaining of a man who had run out of options. She asked where Alara was, and Adrian described the tomb, a glass casket elevated on a stone platform, Alara's body preserved within, unchanged by time, her hands crossed over her chest and wrapped in silver chains, a vampire burial rite meant to prevent the dead from rising, meant to keep them peacefully in the ground. Iris moved forward carefully, her hands outstretched, until her fingers found the glass, smooth and cold, and she traced its surface, feeling the subtle vibration of magic humming through it, a preservation spell that held decay at bay. Adrian was speaking now, his voice rough and halting, and Iris heard him set something down beside the casket, heard the faint clink of metal and broken pieces, and she realized he had brought the shattered music box, the one he had destroyed in his study, an offering or an apology, or both. He began his confession, the words dragged out of him like nails from wood, telling Alara's ghost that he was sorry, that he had failed her and failed their son, that he had tried to save the boy and succeeded only in making him suffer, that he had stolen those 3 minutes and could never give them back. Iris stood very still, listening, her hands resting on the glass casket, and she felt the air grow colder, felt the magic in the room shift and coil like a living thing. And then she heard the chains, the silver chains wrapped around Alara's wrists, and they began to rattle and hiss, and Adrian's confession cut off with a sharp intake of breath. The chains ignited, silver fire erupting along their length, and Adrian cried out, a sound of pure agony, and Iris heard him stumble back, heard the sickening smell of burning flesh fill the crypt, and she turned toward him, her hands reaching out. But before she could speak, Alara's voice filled the space, no longer a whisper, but a full presence, audible and undeniable, her words echoing off stone walls with the weight of 2 centuries of silenced rage. The ghost said that Adrian had hidden their son's death from the court, that he had told them Alara died alone in childbirth, that the child was stillborn, never drew breath, never existed beyond a hope that failed. And Alara's voice was not cruel, but it was implacable, demanding that Adrian speak the truth where he had silenced it, before the court that he had lied to, or else Iris would die as Alara had died, alone and surrounded by lies. The revelation hit Iris like a physical blow, understanding crystallizing in her mind. Adrian had not just failed to save his son, he had erased him, had rewritten the entire tragedy to protect himself, to avoid the political consequences of admitting he had tried to turn a human infant, breaking one of the oldest laws the vampires had, the law that prohibited turning without clear and informed consent. She turned toward where she sensed Adrian, her voice shaking as she said that he had not just lost them, he had erased them, made them ghosts in truth. And Adrian's response was a broken sound, half sob and half bitter laugh. And he said yes, he had lied to the court, told them the child was stillborn to avoid questions, to avoid admitting what he had done in those 3 desperate minutes. Iris felt her anger rise, hot and clarifying, because she understood now that this was not just about grief or failure. It was about cowardice, about choosing political survival over honoring the dead. And she asked him why, demanded to know why his throne mattered more than his son's memory. Adrian's voice came from the floor where he had collapsed, his hands burned and useless, and he told her that if the court learned the truth, they would have grounds to depose him. That the southern clans had been looking for weakness for 200 years, waiting for proof that he was unfit to rule, and a confession that he had broken turning law, that he had tortured an infant in a failed attempt at transformation, would give them exactly what they needed. He said that his rule was all that stood between the northern territories and civil war, that the southern clans would fracture the alliance his family had spent centuries building, and he had chosen stability over honesty, had chosen the lives of thousands over the memory of one. Iris stood over him, the black veins pulsing in her arms, a constant reminder that she had perhaps 48 hours left before her heart stopped. And she felt a strange clarity settle over her, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to lose. She told him that she understood his choice, understood the impossible weight of ruling, but understanding did not make it right, did not change the fact that he had let fear turn him into exactly the kind of king who deserved to be challenged. Her voice was steady now, fierce, and she said that if he wanted to break the curse, if he wanted to save her life and honor Alara's demand, then they would make the court listen, together. Adrian looked up at her. She could feel his gaze even though she could not see it, and he asked what she meant, his voice raw with pain and confusion. Iris knelt beside him, her hands finding his burned ones, the flesh hot and damaged beneath her fingers, and she told him that she would stand beside him when he made his confession, not as a victim he had doomed, but as a witness who chose to be there, and she would play the melody again, the 47 notes that had unlocked this nightmare, and she would force the court to see the curse spreading across her skin, to hear Alara's voice, to understand that this was not ancient history, but a living wound that demanded acknowledgement. She said they would make it impossible for the court to look away, impossible for them to dismiss his confession as weakness, because she would be living proof that silence had consequences, that lies killed. Adrian stared at her, his expression shifting from despair to something that looked almost like hope, fragile and tentative, and he asked why she would do this, why she would risk standing beside him when the court's judgment might fall on her as well. Iris felt the question settle in her chest, felt the honest answer rise up before she could stop it. Because she had spent 7 years since losing her sight, learning to navigate a world that treated her as invisible or broken, and she was tired of being passive, tired of letting other people's fear dictate her choices. And if she was going to die in 48 hours, she wanted it to mean something, wanted to use whatever time she had left to make sure that a child who lived for 3 minutes was finally, truly seen. She did not say the other things she felt, the uncomfortable truth that was beginning to take shape beneath her anger and determination, that she wanted Adrian to be free of this, wanted him to stop carrying this weight alone, wanted to see what kind of man he might become if he let himself grieve honestly, instead of ruling from behind walls of guilt and secrecy. Adrian's hand turned in hers, his burned fingers squeezing gently despite the pain, and he said her name like a prayer, like an apology. And for the first time since she had stumbled into the music room and triggered a 200-year-old curse, Iris felt the ground shift beneath her, felt the nature of their relationship change from captor and victim to something more complicated, something that looked almost like partnership. Alara's voice came again, softer now, approving, saying that this was what she had wanted, not revenge but recognition, not Adrian's destruction but his transformation, and the ghost told them that the court confession must happen within 2 days, before the curse completed its work, and that both of them must be present, both must speak, because the truth required multiple voices to be believed. The candles flickered though there was no wind, and Iris felt the temperature drop further, felt Alara's presence begin to recede, and she called out, asking the ghost if this would be enough, if a public confession would truly break the curse, and Alara's answer came faint and fading. It would break the curse if Adrian spoke not just what he did, but what he took, if he named his son aloud, gave the boy the identity Adrian had stolen when he declared him stillborn, and only then would the debt be paid. The crypt fell silent except for Adrian's ragged breathing and the eternal hiss of enchanted flames, and Iris helped him to his feet, her hands supporting his burned ones, and they stood together in the cold darkness, 2 people bound by magic and mortality, and a choice that would either save them both or destroy them together. And Iris realized with a start that she was no longer afraid of dying, she was afraid of failing, afraid that Adrian would lose his nerve at the last moment and choose his throne over the truth. And she would have to watch him repeat the same mistake that had damned him 200 years ago. Adrian seemed to sense her fear because he told her quietly that he would do it. He would stand before the court and confess everything, and if they took his crown, he would accept that consequence. Because Alara was right, he had stolen more than time, he had stolen his son's existence, and no throne was worth that price. Iris felt something in her chest loosen, felt the first thread of trust weave between them, and she said that they would face the court together, and whatever happened after, at least the truth would be spoken. At least one small boy who lived for 3 minutes would finally have a witness who acknowledged he had been real. Adrian summoned the court at sunset. Standing in Blackthorn Hall with the weight of 2 centuries pressing down on his shoulders, and he sent messengers to every major house in the Northern Territories with a formal notice citing a matter of blood law that required immediate assembly, knowing that the phrase would draw them like sharks to blood, because blood law was invoked only when ancient rules had been broken or were about to be. He did not mention Iris in the summons, did not explain the nature of the confession he planned to make. But he knew the gossip had already spread through the castle like wildfire, servants whispering about the blind human woman in the east wing, about the curse marks on her arms, about the king carrying her through the halls in the dead of night. And by the time the first members of court began to arrive, the story had grown teeth and claws. Lady Seraphine Voss of the Southern clans arrived 6 hours early, her timing deliberate and calculated, sweeping into the castle with an entourage that included 3 reporters carrying enchanted cameras designed to capture aura and essence rather than mere physical image, and a legal arbiter whose presence announced that Seraphine expected rules to be broken and wanted documentation. Adrian met her in the great hall, his expression carefully neutral, and Seraphine smiled with the particular coldness of someone who had been waiting 200 years for an opportunity and finally saw it approaching. She was beautiful in the way ancient vampires often were, her features refined by centuries into something almost porcelain, her dark hair swept back from a face that revealed nothing. And when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of formal court language, asking Adrian about the rumors, about the human woman, about why the king had invoked blood law without providing context. Adrian told her that all would be explained at the formal session, that he had called the court together for a public confession, and Seraphine's eyes gleamed with interest as she asked what exactly he planned to confess. But Adrian refused to elaborate, his jaw tight with tension he could not quite hide. Seraphine let the silence stretch, then mentioned almost casually that she had heard Adrian was harboring a human on castle grounds, a woman who had entered without proper invitation or documentation, and according to the treaty that governed human-vampire relations, any human on protected vampire land required explicit written invitation witnessed by at least 2 members of court, otherwise their presence constituted trespass, and the vampire in question could be charged with kidnapping or unlawful detention. Adrian felt the trap closing, but kept his voice level as he explained that Iris Tremaine was his guest, that she had sought shelter during a storm, and he had offered it. And Seraphine nodded slowly, her expression sympathetic in a way that made Adrian's instincts scream danger, and she said she would very much like to meet this guest, to ensure she was being treated appropriately and was not under any duress. Adrian had no choice but to agree, protocol demanded it, and he led Seraphine and her entourage to the sitting room where Iris waited, dressed in borrowed clothes that marked her as out of place, her hands folded in her lap to hide the black veins that now reached past her elbows and crept toward her shoulders. Seraphine entered with the deliberate grace of a predator assessing prey, her gaze taking in every detail, and she introduced herself to Iris with perfect courtesy, asking how the young woman had come to be at Blackthorn Castle, whether she felt safe, whether she was free to leave if she chose. Iris answered carefully, her voice steady despite the fear Adrian could see in the tension of her shoulders, explaining that she had gotten lost in the storm, found an open door, played the piano in what she thought was an abandoned room, and that was when things had gone wrong, though she did not elaborate on what wrong meant. Seraphine's attention sharpened, her eyes dropping to Iris's hands, and she asked Iris to show her palms, "Please, just a formality," and when Iris hesitated, Seraphine's voice turned silken and firm, reminding her that as a representative of the Southern clans, she had authority to ensure treaty compliance. Iris slowly unclenched her hands and held them out, and the black veins were visible even in the dim light, spreading like cracks through porcelain, and Seraphine drew in a sharp breath, stepping back and invoking the quarantine law with the efficiency of someone who had planned this exact moment. She declared that Iris was contaminated with dark magic, that her presence posed a potential threat to the court and to herself, and that for her own protection and the safety of others, she must be isolated in warded quarters until the curse was identified and neutralized, or until she succumbed to it, whichever came first. Adrian started to protest, But Seraphine cut him off, her voice hardening as she reminded him that quarantine law superseded personal preference, that it existed precisely to prevent curses from spreading, and that if he refused to comply, she would have grounds to call a vote of no confidence in his leadership right now, tonight, before the blood law session even began. Adrian looked at Iris, saw the fear in her sightless eyes, and made a calculation that felt like swallowing glass. He nodded his agreement, knowing that fighting Seraphine now would only make things worse, would give her ammunition to claim he was acting irrationally, and he told himself he could protect Iris better by playing along, by saving his political capital for the confession itself. Iris was taken to a warded guest chamber in the North Tower, escorted by two of Seraphine's people, and Adrian watched her go with a sick feeling in his gut, knowing he had just made the same mistake he always made, choosing strategy over honesty, control over trust. Iris sat in the warded chamber and felt the walls closing in, not physically but magically, the runes carved into stone humming with a frequency that made her teeth ache and her skin prickle. And she understood that these wards were designed to suppress magic, to contain curses, to keep anything supernatural from entering or leaving. The room was small and cold, lit by a single candle that Seraphine's people had left on a table before locking the door, and Iris explored the space by touch, mapping the dimensions, the bed against one wall, the chair, the door with no handle on the inside, the window too narrow for a body to fit through even if she could reach it. She felt the black veins pulsing in her arms, a constant reminder that time was running out. Perhaps 36 hours now before the curse reached her heart, and she tried not to think about dying alone in this stone cell while Adrian made his confession without her. She sat on the bed and wrapped her arms around herself, and that was when she heard Alara's voice again, clearer than before, no longer a whisper, but a presence that filled the small room with cold certainty. The ghost said that Adrian thought he was protecting Iris by fighting alone, that he had done the same with Alara 200 years ago, refusing to let her share the burden of their son's dying, making decisions for her as though her grief and her choice mattered less than his need to control the outcome. And he would lose Iris the way he lost Alara, by refusing to let her choose her own risk. Iris felt anger flare hot and bright in her chest, understanding settling over her like ice water, because she knew Adrian well enough now to see the pattern. He planned to confess before the court and take full blame, probably claim that Iris was an innocent bystander who had nothing to do with breaking the curse, and he would try to satisfy Alara's demands without requiring Iris to be present, without acknowledging that the curse had specifically bound them together, that her testimony was part of what Alara required. The ghost confirmed it, her voice sad and knowing, explaining that the curse could not be broken by Adrian's confession alone, that Iris must be there to witness it, to speak her own truth about what she had seen and heard, because the magic required multiple voices, required the woman who carried the death to acknowledge the man who caused it, and without that, the curse would simply continue its work. Iris stood abruptly, her hands clenching into fists despite the pain it caused, and she told Alara's ghost that she needed to escape this room, needed to reach the court before Adrian made his confession, and she asked if the ghost could help, if there was any way to break the wards from the inside. Alara's voice turned thoughtful, considering, and she said that wards were designed to suppress hostile magic, but they were not designed to suppress sound, not designed to recognize music as a weapon, and she reminded Iris of how she had broken the wards in the music room by playing the 47-note sequence, how the magic had responded to intention and melody rather than force. Iris felt hope spark in her chest, and she asked if singing would work the same way, if she could use her voice to crack the wards the way she had used the piano, and Alara said yes, if the intention was pure, if the melody carried truth rather than deception, the wards would fracture because they could not distinguish between curse-breaking and curse-making, could not tell the difference between magic meant to harm and magic meant to reveal. Iris took a breath, steadying herself, and began to sing the melody, the 47 notes that had started all of this, and her voice filled the small chamber, echoing off stone walls. And she felt the wards shiver and resist, felt them push back against the sound, but she kept singing, pouring everything she had into the music, her fear and her anger and her determination that Adrian would not repeat his mistakes, that she would not let him erase her the way he had erased his son. The runes on the walls began to glow, faint at first, and then brighter. And Iris heard the sound of cracking stone, hairline fractures spreading through the warding spells, and she sang louder, her voice raw and fierce, and the door's lock snapped with a sound like breaking ice. Adrian stood in his private chamber with Dr. Halloran, the older vampire's expression grave as he examined the progression of the curse through a series of diagnostic spells that made the air shimmer and hum, and Halloran confirmed what Adrian already knew. The curse had accelerated, the veins now reaching Iris's shoulders, and at this rate, she had perhaps 12 hours before it reached her heart, maybe less. Adrian asked if there was any medical way to pause the curse, to buy them time, and Halloran was silent for a long moment before admitting there was one option, dangerous and irreversible, a transfusion of vampire blood directly into the cursed person's system, which would slow the curse's progression by binding the recipient's life force to the vampire's own. It was an ancient practice, Halloran explained, called a courting bond because it was traditionally used by vampires who wished to extend a human lover's life without forcing a full transformation, a way to share vitality without erasing mortality. But the bond was absolute and could not be undone, and if the vampire died, the human would die instantly, their heart stopping the moment the connection severed. Adrian felt his chest tighten at the implications, understanding that if he performed this transfusion and then the court deposed him, if they executed the sentence that sometimes followed breaking turning law, Iris would die with him, her fate chained to his in a way that gave her no agency, no choice. Halloran watched him carefully and said that the transfusion would buy perhaps 12 hours, enough time to get through the court session, enough time for Adrian to make his confession and hope that breaking the curse took effect before the bond's borrowed time ran out. But it was a terrible risk, a gamble that assumed everything would go according to plan. Adrian asked what happened if he refused, if he let the curse run its natural course, and Halloran said simply that Iris would be dead by dawn, that there was no other medical intervention that could help her, and Adrian would have to watch another innocent person die because of his choices, because of secrets he had kept for too long. The decision settled over Adrian like a weight, inevitable and crushing, and he told Halloran to prepare the materials, knowing even as he spoke that he was repeating the pattern Alara had cursed him for, making choices for others, taking their agency in the name of protecting them. But he could not bear the alternative, could not stand by and watch Iris die when he had the power to give her more time. Halloran prepared the transfusion in silence, his movements efficient and practiced, and Adrian went to the warded chamber where Iris was being held, using his authority to override Seraphine's guards, and he found Iris unconscious on the bed, the curse having drained her strength, and he lifted her carefully and carried her back to his chamber where Halloran waited with silver instruments and bowls of water infused with herbs meant to ease the transition. The transfusion itself was a ritual as old as vampire kind, Adrian biting his own wrist to open the vein, pressing the wound to Iris's mouth, letting his blood flow past her lips, while Halloran chanted words in a language that predated Latin, words that bound life to life and made two hearts beat as one. Iris stirred, her body responding to the blood even in sleep, and Adrian felt the bond snap into place like a lock turning, felt suddenly and intimately aware of her heartbeat, her breathing, the warmth of her body against his cold skin. And he knew she could feel him too. Feel the slow, steady rhythm of his heart that beat only a handful of times per minute. Feel the ancient coldness that ran through his veins. The curse's progression slowed immediately, the black veins stopping their advance, frozen at her shoulders. And Halloran confirmed that the transfusion had worked, that Iris now had 12 hours, maybe 15 if they were lucky. But the bond was permanent and irreversible, and if Adrian fell, so would she. Adrian laid Iris back on the bed and watched her sleep, watched the rise and fall of her chest, and he felt the bond between them like a second skin, intimate and invasive. And he wondered what she would say when she woke, whether she would forgive him for making this choice without asking, or whether she would see it for what it was. Another act of control dressed up as protection. Another theft of agency in the name of love he had no right to feel. Iris woke to the sensation of a heartbeat that was not her own, slow and cold and utterly foreign, beating somewhere in the center of her chest alongside her own rapid human rhythm. And for a disoriented moment, she thought she was dreaming, thought the curse had finally reached her heart and was rewriting it. But then she felt the bond, felt the invisible cord that connected her to someone else. And she knew with sick certainty what Adrian had done. She sat up too quickly, her head spinning, and she felt his presence like a weight in her mind, not thoughts exactly, but emotions, his fear and his guilt, and his desperate relief that she was alive, and she wanted to scream at the violation of it, at the way he had reached into her body and tied her fate to his without asking, without giving her the chance to say yes or no. She called for him, and he appeared in the doorway almost instantly, as though he had been waiting just outside, and Iris felt his approach through the bond before she heard his footsteps, felt his anxiety spike when he saw she was awake. She asked him what he had done, her voice shaking with fury, and Adrian explained in careful, measured tones about the transfusion, about the courting bond, about how it would give her 12 hours and slow the curse enough to get through the court session, and Iris listened in silence until he finished, and then she said the only thing that mattered. "You did not ask, you just took my choice." Adrian's presence in the bond flared with guilt and defensiveness, and he said he had given her time, that was all he had left to give, that without the transfusion she would be dead already, and there would be no court session, no chance to break the curse. No future at all. Iris felt tears of frustration burn behind her eyes, and she told him that he had learned nothing, that Alara cursed him for exactly this, for making decisions for the people he claimed to love, for stealing their agency in the name of protection, and now he had done it again, bound her to him in a way that made her survival dependent on his, made her a hostage to his political fate. She asked what would happen if the court deposed him, if they executed him for breaking turning law, and Adrian's silence was answer enough, the bond flooding with his awareness that yes, if he died, she would die too, instantly and without warning. Iris laughed, a sound with no humor in it, and said that he had not saved her, he had chained her, made her death conditional on his survival, and now she had no choice but to fight for him, to stand beside him at the confession, not because she wanted to, but because her life literally depended on it. Adrian moved closer. She felt him kneel beside the bed, and he took her hand carefully, his fingers cold against her skin, and through the bond she felt his anguish, his awareness that he had repeated the exact pattern that damned him, and his voice was raw as he said he was sorry. He had not known what else to do. He could not watch her die when he had the power to stop it. Iris wanted to stay angry, wanted to hold on to her fury, but she felt his emotions through the bond, and they were too honest to dismiss, too desperate and broken, and she realized with uncomfortable clarity that Adrian's choices had never been about control for its own sake. They came from a terror of loss so profound it overrode everything else, a fear that had calcified over 2 centuries into a pattern he could not break alone. She told him that they would deal with the bond later, that right now they needed to focus on surviving the court session, on making sure his confession satisfied the curse before the 12 hours ran out, and Adrian nodded, his relief palpable through the bond, and he helped her stand, her body still weak from the curse and the transfusion. The court session was set for midnight, Seraphine had announced, giving all the major houses time to arrive and giving her reporters time to set up their equipment. And Iris knew that meant they had perhaps 6 hours to prepare, 6 hours to figure out how to present a confession that would break a curse, honor a ghost, and not get Adrian executed in the process. And through the bond, she felt his determination and his fear warring with each other, felt the weight of 200 years of silence pressing down on both of them. And she squeezed his hand and said they would face it together, because now they had no choice. Their fates were bound, and they would rise or fall as one. Iris found herself back in the warded chamber after the transfusion, Seraphine's guards having returned her there with cold efficiency, and she sat in the darkness listening to the sound of her own breathing overlaid with Adrian's heartbeat, that slow, steady rhythm that pulsed through the bond, like a second clock counting down to midnight. She knew the court session was scheduled to begin in less than 3 hours, knew that Adrian planned to make his confession without her, despite everything they had discussed in the tomb, despite the fact that Alara's ghost had made it clear that both of them needed to be present for the curse to break. And she felt fury rise hot and clarifying in her chest at his continued inability to trust her with her own choices. The wards hummed against her skin, that oppressive magical pressure designed to contain curses and suppress supernatural activity. But as Iris sat listening to the frequency of the runes, she remembered what Ilara had told her earlier, that wards could not distinguish between hostile magic and harmless sound, could not recognize music as a weapon or a tool. She stood and moved to the center of the small room, her hands outstretched to feel the dimensions of the space, and she began to sing the 47-note melody, the sequence that had unlocked the diary and triggered the curse, and her voice filled the chamber with sound that resonated against stone walls and made the air shimmer. The wards resisted at first, pushing back against the melody as though trying to smother it, but Iris kept singing, pouring her intention into each note, her desire to break free and reach the court before Adrian could repeat his pattern of silencing the people who needed to speak. And she felt the runes begin to crack, hairline fractures spreading through the magical barriers like ice under pressure. The door's lock snapped with a sound like breaking bone, and Iris stopped singing, breathing hard, and she pushed the door open and stepped into the corridor beyond, her heart racing with triumph and fear. She had no idea where in the castle she was. The North Tower Seraphine had mentioned could be anywhere, but Iris had spent 7 years navigating the world without sight, and she had developed skills that most sighted people never considered, chief among them the ability to map spaces through sound. She began to walk, her footsteps echoing off stone walls, and she listened to the way the echoes returned, the way they changed when she passed doorways or turned corners, building a mental map of the castle's layout through echolocation, the same technique that had allowed her to find the music room on that first rain-soaked night. She moved quickly but carefully, one hand trailing along the wall for orientation, and she heard voices ahead, the murmur of many people gathering, and she followed the sound down spiral staircases and through corridors that grew wider and more ornate, the air changing from the cold sterility of the tower to the warmer atmosphere of the castle's public spaces. She heard the great doors of Blackthorn Hall standing open, heard the rustle of fabric and the low conversation of dozens of vampires assembling for the blood law session, and she slipped inside, keeping to the shadows along the wall, her presence unnoticed in the crowd's anticipation. Adrian stood before the empty throne in Blackthorn Hall and felt the weight of every gaze in the room, hundreds of years of vampiric politics concentrated into this single moment, and he knew that what he said in the next few minutes would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of the Northern Territories, the stability his family had built over centuries, and possibly the life of the woman whose heartbeat he could feel through the bond, steady and strong somewhere far above him in the warded tower. The hall was packed, every major house represented, vampires in formal attire arranged in a semicircle around the throne dais, and at the center sat Lady Seraphine Voss in the arbiter's seat, her expression calm and expectant, a predator who had finally cornered her prey and was savoring the moment. The reporters had set up their enchanted cameras along the walls, devices that would capture not just image, but aura and essence, creating a record that could be shared across all vampire territories. and Adrian knew that meant his confession would be permanent and public in a way that allowed no retreat, no revision. He took a breath he did not need and began to speak, his voice carrying across the hall with the authority of someone who had ruled for 300 years but was now choosing vulnerability over power. He said that 200 years ago he had told this court that his queen Alara died in childbirth, and the child with her, that he had stood before them and described a stillbirth, a tragedy of nature that required no explanation and no investigation. And he paused, letting the silence stretch, and then he said simply that he had lied. The room went utterly still, the kind of stillness that precedes violence or revelation, and Adrian felt every eye fixed on him as he continued, describing the truth he had buried for 2 centuries. That the child had lived, had drawn breath and cried, had existed for 3 full minutes before his body began to fail, and in those minutes Adrian had made a choice that broke one of the oldest and most sacred laws their kind had, the law that prohibited turning without clear and informed consent. He described cutting his own wrist, pressing it to the infant's mouth, forcing vampire blood down the baby's throat in a desperate attempt to trigger transformation and save a life that was already slipping away. And he described the screaming that followed, the way the child's tiny body convulsed as the vampire blood burned through veins too small and too human to contain it. And he described holding his son while the boy died for the second time, this death slower and more agonizing than the first. Adrian's voice cracked on the last words, but he forced himself to continue, to explain that he had then told the court the child was stillborn, had erased those 3 minutes from the official record, had buried his son in an unmarked grave and forbidden anyone to speak of him, all to protect himself from the consequences of breaking turning law, all to preserve his throne and his authority at the cost of his son's existence. The confession hung in the air like smoke, and Adrian stood with his hands at his sides, no longer defending, no longer hiding, and he waited for the judgment he knew was coming. Seraphine stood, her movements deliberate and precise, and her voice cut through the shocked silence with the clarity of someone who had prepared for this exact scenario. She said that Adrian had just confessed to unlawful turning, an act that carried penalties ranging from forced abdication to execution depending on circumstances and intent, and he had also confessed to falsifying a death record, which constituted obstruction of blood law and carried its own set of consequences. She reminded the court that these were not minor infractions. These were foundational violations of the treaties that governed vampire society, and while she understood that grief might explain Adrian's choices, it did not excuse them, and the law required that he face judgment. She called for an immediate vote, invoking her authority as arbiter to demand the court choose between 3 options: execution, full abdication, or probationary rule with significant restrictions on Adrian's power. The room erupted in conversation, vampires turning to one another to debate in low, urgent voices, and Adrian stood silent, accepting, because he had known this would be the cost, and he had chosen to pay it anyway. And through the bond, he felt Iris's heartbeat quicken with alarm, felt her awareness of his danger, even though she was locked away in the tower, and he sent her what comfort he could through the connection, a wordless reassurance that he was ready for whatever came next. Iris heard Seraphine's voice calling for a vote and felt Adrian's resignation through the bond, his acceptance of punishment. And she knew with absolute certainty that he planned to let the court judge him without fighting back, without presenting the full context, without allowing her to speak the testimony that Alara had said was necessary for the curse to break. She pushed away from the wall where she had been standing and began to move through the crowd, her hands outstretched to part the vampires who stood between her and the center of the hall. And she felt them notice her, felt the ripple of recognition spread through the assembly as they realized the cursed human had escaped her confinement. She reached the edge of the open space around the throne dais and heard the piano, the same Steinway from the music room, and she understood that someone had moved it here, perhaps as evidence or perhaps as a stage prop for the drama unfolding. and she walked toward it with the certainty of someone who had navigated by sound her entire adult life. She sat on the bench and placed her hands on the keys, and the room fell silent again, this time with confusion and anticipation rather than shock, and Iris spoke, her voice carrying across the hall with the force of someone who had nothing left to lose. She said that Adrian did not steal time, he stole silence. He took his son's existence and buried it in lies and locked rooms, and if this court wanted to punish him for trying to save a dying child, then they should punish her too, because she would have done the same thing, would have broken any law and faced any consequence if it meant even the smallest chance of keeping someone she loved alive. She began to play the melody, the 47 notes flowing from her fingers with the precision of muscle memory, and the curse responded immediately. The black veins that had been frozen at her shoulders since the transfusion, suddenly flaring bright and vivid, spreading down her arms to her hands, and making the skin around them look cracked and brittle. The court gasped collectively, seeing the curse made visible, and the diary that had been brought as evidence began to smoke and ignite, silver flames erupting from its pages, and Iris felt the temperature in the hall drop, felt the presence of something vast and ancient gathering in the space above them. Ilara's ghost materialized in the center of the hall, translucent and silver-lit, her form more solid than it had been in the tomb, more real, and Iris understood that the collective presence of so many vampires had broken the veil between living and dead, had given the ghost enough power to manifest fully and speak her piece before witnesses who could not dismiss her as hallucination or trick. The ghost turned slowly, her gaze sweeping across the assembled court, and when she spoke her voice was clear and cold and filled with 2 centuries of withheld grief. She said that she had not cursed Adrian for trying to save their son, had not punished him for the desperation that made him break turning law in a moment of impossible choice, but she had cursed him for hiding, for turning their son's death into a political footnote, for robbing the boy of a name and a grave and a memory, for erasing him so thoroughly that even Adrian's own court did not know he had existed. She said that the theft was not time but acknowledgement, not life but truth, and she turned to face Adrian directly, her expression sorrowful and implacable, and she told him that if this court wanted justice, they should give his son what Adrian had taken, should speak the boy's name aloud, and let him be mourned the way any child deserved to be mourned, publicly and honestly, and without shame. Adrian was shaking. Iris could see it even without sight, could feel it through the bond, his entire body trembling with the weight of what Ilara was demanding, and the hall was silent except for the crackle of silver flames and the faint hum of the curse working through Iris's veins. Seraphine started to speak, to protest that ghosts had no standing in blood law, but Ilara's ghost cut her off with a look that froze the words in her throat. And the ghost said that she was not asking for legal judgment, she was asking for basic decency, for the acknowledgement that a child who lived for 3 minutes deserved to be remembered as having lived at all. Adrian dropped to his knees on the stone floor, his control finally shattering completely, and Iris heard him whisper the name, so quiet at first that only she caught it through the bond, and then louder, his voice breaking. Theo. His name was Theo. The diary's silver flames turned brilliant white, and then faded, the pages curling to ash, and the curse stopped its progression across Iris's arms, the black veins freezing and then beginning to recede, pulling back from her hands and wrists and elbows, like tide retreating from shore. Ilara's ghost smiled, the expression faint and infinitely sad, and she said that was all she had wanted, for her son to be real, for his existence to be spoken aloud and witnessed. And she looked at Iris with gratitude and approval before beginning to dissolve, her form fading into silver mist that dissipated into the air and left behind only the faint scent of roses and rain. The curse broke completely, the last of the black veins disappearing from Iris's skin, and she felt the pressure in her chest ease, felt her own heartbeat settle into a rhythm that was wholly hers, even though Adrian's slower pulse still echoed through the bond. The court sat in stunned silence, processing what they had just witnessed, and Seraphine stood again, her expression carefully neutral, and she said that while the curse was lifted and the ghost satisfied, the law was not so easily appeased, that Adrian had still confessed to breaking turning law and falsifying records, and the vote must proceed. She called for the decision, and the court responded in voices that ranged from sympathetic to harsh. And when the count was tallied, it came to 60% in favor of some form of punishment, 40% willing to let the confession stand as sufficient penance. Seraphine announced that given the divided opinion, she was invoking the compromise protocol, a middle path that would allow Adrian to keep his throne but strip him of absolute power for a period of 50 years, during which time the southern clans would gain a seat on his council and he would lose his veto authority over major decisions. She said this would serve justice without destabilizing the northern territories, would punish Adrian's deception without rewarding it, and she asked if Adrian accepted these terms. Adrian stood slowly, his face pale but composed, and he said yes, he accepted, because keeping his throne mattered less than speaking the truth, and if the cost of honesty was shared power, then he would pay it gladly. He stepped down from the dais, no longer standing as an absolute monarch, but as a king who had chosen vulnerability over authority, and Iris felt through the bond his mixture of grief and relief, his awareness that he had lost something, but gained something far more valuable, the ability to look at himself without shame. The court began to disperse, vampires filing out in small groups to discuss what they had witnessed, and Iris remained at the piano, her hands resting on the keys, and she felt Adrian approach before she heard him, felt his presence through the bond like warmth against her skin. He knelt beside the bench and took her hand, the one that had been covered in curse marks, and he said her name like a prayer, like an apology, and Iris turned toward him and said that he had finally learned to let someone stand beside him instead of in front of him, and that was worth more than any throne. The hall emptied around them, leaving only the two of them and the piano and the fading scent of roses, and Iris knew that they had crossed some threshold together, that whatever came next would be built on truth rather than secrets, on choice rather than control, and that the bond between them was no longer just magic, but something they had both decided to honor. Iris walked through the emptying halls of Blackthorn Castle with Adrian beside her, their footsteps echoing in the pre-dawn silence, and she felt the bond between them humming quiet and steady, his heartbeat layered beneath hers like a bass note supporting a melody. The court had dispersed after the vote, vampires departing in clusters to process what they had witnessed, and Seraphine had left last, pausing to tell Adrian in a voice meant to carry that she looked forward to working with him under the new arrangement. Her smile sharp enough to draw blood, but her eyes holding something that might have been respect. Adrian had not responded, had simply nodded and turned away, and now he led Iris through corridors she was beginning to recognize by sound and scent, the particular acoustics of each hallway, the way air moved differently near windows versus solid walls. And when they reached the east wing, she felt the temperature drop and knew they were approaching the music room where this had all begun 3 days and a lifetime ago. The door stood open, no longer sealed, and Adrian guided her inside with a hand at her elbow, and Iris felt the space open around her, heard the familiar dimensions of the room, and smelled something unexpected: beeswax and lemon oil, the scent of recent cleaning. She asked if someone had been in here, and Adrian confirmed it, his voice quiet, explaining that the castle staff had restored the room overnight without being asked, had polished the floors and cleaned the instruments and repaired the shattered chandelier, a gesture of respect or perhaps relief that the curse was broken, and their king had survived his confession. Iris moved toward the piano, her hands finding its familiar shape, and she felt that it too had been cleaned and tuned, the keys smooth under her fingers, and resting on the closed lid was the diary, its pages now blank, the curse fulfilled, and the magic dissipated, leaving only leather and paper and the faint residual scent of Ilara's grief. Adrian stood somewhere behind her. She could feel his presence through the bond, and when he spoke, his voice carried a careful neutrality that she had learned meant he was hiding something painful. He told her that now the curse was broken, the bond would begin to fade, that courting bonds not maintained through regular renewal would dissolve over approximately 3 days, and by the end of that time she would be free of him, free to leave the castle and return to whatever life she had before the storm brought her here. He said he would arrange safe passage back to Kinloch or anywhere else she wished to go, would provide money and references and anything she needed to start over, and his words were generous and his tone was controlled, but through the bond, Iris felt his grief, felt him bracing for her departure as though it were inevitable. Iris stood very still, her hands resting on the piano lid, and she thought about the past 3 days, about stumbling into a sealed room and playing a melody that unlocked 2 centuries of secrets, about carrying a death curse and hearing a ghost and standing before a vampire court to witness a confession that should have been spoken generations ago. She thought about Adrian's pattern of making choices for people he loved, of stealing their agency in the name of protection. And she thought about her own pattern of accepting whatever life handed her, of treating her blindness as a limitation that made her less capable of choosing risk and adventure and love. She walked to the piano bench and sat, her fingers finding the keys, and she began to play, not the 47-note melody that had caused so much pain, but something new, a composition that formed itself under her hands without conscious thought, something that spoke of storms and shelters and the strange alchemy that turned strangers into allies into something more. The melody filled the room, gentle and searching, and when she finished, she let the last notes fade into silence before she spoke, her voice steady and sure. She asked what would happen if she did not want the bond to fade, and she felt Adrian go very still behind her, felt his shock and hope and fear cascade through the connection between them. She continued, not giving him time to interrupt or deflect, telling him that she was blind but not broken, that her inability to see had never made her weak or incapable, and she was not afraid of him, not afraid of his nature or his past, or the political mess he now faced with a weakened throne and enemies circling. What she was afraid of was leaving, walking away from this castle and this impossible man, and spending the rest of her mortal life wondering what they could have been if she had been brave enough to choose the risk. She turned on the bench to face where she sensed him standing, and she said that she wanted to stay, wanted to see what came next, wanted to choose him the way he had finally learned to let himself be chosen. Adrian moved toward her. She heard the rustle of his clothes and felt him through the bond drawing closer, and then he was kneeling beside the piano bench the way he had knelt in the tomb and in the hall, making himself lower than her, making himself vulnerable in the only way he knew how. He took her hand, the one that had carried the curse's black veins, and he pressed it between both of his, and his voice when he spoke was raw with emotions he had not allowed himself to feel in 2 centuries. He told her that if she truly wanted to stay, there was a way to make the bond permanent, not through turning, because he would never force that transformation on anyone ever again, but through an ancient ritual called the breath bond that predated most of vampire law and custom. He explained that a vampire could share a single breath with a human at dawn, a literal exchange of air from the vampire's lungs to the human's. And if this exchange was repeated every dawn for a full year, the bond would settle into something permanent and sustainable, extending the human's lifespan without erasing their mortality, tying their fates together but gently, allowing the human to age while the vampire remained unchanged. It was fragile and required daily renewal and acknowledged the fundamental inequality between mortal and immortal, but it was real and it was honest, and it gave both parties the ability to choose continuation or release at any point. Iris felt her breath catch at the implications, at the image of standing with Adrian every dawn for a year, breathing his breath and feeling his life force mingle with hers. And she asked the question that mattered most. What happened at the end of the year? Did the bond lock into place forever, or did it require something else? Adrian's answer was simple and perfect. They would choose again. Every year they would choose, renewing the bond or letting it fade as their lives and circumstances dictated. And it would never be a prison, because it would always require consent from both of them. Iris felt tears prick behind her eyes. The good kind. The kind that came from being offered exactly what she needed, in exactly the way she needed it. And she leaned forward and found his face with her hands, tracing the lines of his cheekbones and jaw. And she kissed him, her first kiss in 7 years, soft and tentative and tasting of hope. Adrian made a sound low in his throat, surprise and gratitude and desire all tangled together, and he kissed her back with a gentleness that belied his strength, his hands cradling her face as though she were something precious and breakable. And through the bond, Iris felt his heart rate increase, felt his control slip in ways that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with wanting. They broke apart slowly, breathing hard, and the sky outside the stained glass windows was beginning to pale with the approach of dawn, soft gray light filtering into the music room and touching everything with silver. And Iris said yes. She wanted to try. 1 year of dawns and choices and building something together. And Adrian said yes in return, his voice steady despite the tremor she could feel through the bond. The sun was rising now, so true dawn breaking over the Scottish Highlands, and Adrian stood and moved toward the shadows at the edge of the room where the light could not reach him, his nature preventing him from standing in direct sunlight without pain. And Iris remained at the piano, her hands returning to the keys, and she began to play again, a new melody that spoke of beginnings rather than endings. On the piano's music stand, placed there by Adrian's hand, was a single sheet of cream paper, and written on it in black ink and careful script was a name, Theo. Iris's fingers brushed the paper as she played, and she felt the weight of what it represented. A child finally acknowledged, a silence finally broken, a theft finally returned, and she knew that this small memorial mattered more than any throne or title or political compromise, because it made real what had been erased and gave dignity to 3 minutes of life that deserved to be remembered. She played, and Adrian watched from the shadows, and neither of them spoke because there was nothing more to say, the decision made and the future uncertain but chosen. And the music filled the room the way it must have filled it 200 years ago when Alara sat at this same piano and composed a lullaby for a son who would never hear it. The raven landed on the windowsill with a harsh caw that interrupted the melody, and Iris stopped playing, her head turning toward the sound, and she heard the flutter of wings and the tap of claws on stone. Adrian moved closer, his footsteps quick, and Iris felt his tension spike through the bond, felt his recognition of something significant. She asked what it was, and Adrian described the bird, a raven larger than natural, its eyes too intelligent, carrying a rolled parchment sealed with red wax, and he took the letter from the bird's talons and examined the seal, and Iris heard his sharp intake of breath. She asked what the seal showed, and Adrian told her it was the crest of the Eastern Territories, a vampire faction that had not contacted the Northern Territories in over a century, a group that had historically remained neutral in all political disputes, and whose sudden interest in Adrian's affairs could not be coincidence. The letter remained sealed. Adrian made no move to open it, and Iris felt through the bond his calculation, his awareness that his weakened political position had made him a target or perhaps an opportunity, and that whatever this letter contained would complicate the fragile peace they had just achieved. Iris reached out, and her fingers found the letter where Adrian held it, felt the texture of expensive parchment and the raised wax of the seal. And she asked the question that needed asking. Should she be worried? Was this the beginning of new trouble that would threaten what they were trying to build? Adrian was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing the edge of the seal, and then he answered in a voice that was calm and steady, and edged with the particular resignation of someone who had ruled long enough to know that peace was always temporary, not yet. The raven cawed again, a sound like laughter or warning, and it spread its wings and launched itself back into the dawn sky. And Iris turned back to the piano and began to play once more, the new melody continuing despite the interruption, because whatever came next, they would face it together, one dawn and one choice at a time, and the music room that had been sealed in silence for 200 years was finally, truly alive again.